All right, welcome to Module 6, where we're going to get into energy attribute certificates in detail. So reviewing the overall series that this is a part of, the purpose of this is to give all of you the skills and background required to evaluate, set, and execute on a renewable energy strategy for your operations. We're in phase 3 of this, so this is the execute phase, where we've already set a goal, we've done a lot of research up front, now we're figuring out how to execute on that. In this module specifically, we're going to be talking about energy attribute certificates, or EACs. We touched briefly on these in module 5. These are a key accounting mechanism for all forms of renewable energy procurement. They're also a standalone method of procuring renewable energy, and that's what we're going to talk about primarily today. So again, here's where we're sitting in the overall progress. This is module 6. This is the first of 3 modules specifically about renewable energy procurement methods. And again, we're talking about these on-paper forms of renewable energy procurement, unbundled EACs. Okay, what are EACs? As we talked about in Module 5, EACs are both the accounting mechanism behind renewable energy, and they're also the instrument that conveys the renewable energy attribute of a certain unit of electricity consumption. So fundamentally, an electron is an electron, right? Whether it is generated from a coal plant or a wind farm, if we're looking at an actual electron, it looks the same. It doesn't say I'm a coal electron or I'm a wind power electron. So EACs allow us to actually track the attribute, because there's a difference between, in our opinion, as people who care about sustainability, there is a difference between a coal electron and a wind electron. So EACs are generated when a megawatt hour of renewable electricity is generated, and they contain the environmental benefits of that renewable energy generation. So fundamentally, the way it works is you have a megawatt hour of electricity, you have one EAC, and together they form 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity. Disaggregated though, they are, if you have a megawatt hour of electricity, it's just electrons. And if you have an energy attribute certificate, it's just a piece of paper or an item in a spreadsheet. Only together do they form renewable energy. Again, one EAC is the equivalent of 1 megawatt hour, which is a concept we talked about in earlier modules. A megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. It's kind of the fundamental unit where we track energy consumption. Now, EACs can be combined with the electricity that they were generated alongside with, or they can be separated and sold sort of separately. So in this industry, we call this bundled or unbundled EACs. So bundled EAC, for example, would be you have on-site solar on your roof, you are using the electricity, you're using the EAC, and those are kind of, they were generated together, they stay together, you're consuming both at the same time. Alternatively, you could have an on-site solar system and you could use the solar, use the electricity from that system, and then you could go and you could take the EAC and you can sell it to someone else. And when you're doing that, you're allowing that other person to make a claim to that renewable energy. So they can take the EAC, they can apply it to a megawatt hour of their own electricity, and they can claim to be using renewable electricity. Whereas you are now you're just using electrons, because you've sold off the energy attribute of that electricity consumption. All you have now from your on-site solar system are electrons. So you actually can't claim to be using any renewable energy. So when we talk about EACs as a standalone procurement method, what we're really talking about are unbundled EACs. So EACs that have been separated from the underlying electricity, and you can purchase these on the market, pretty simply, and you can apply them to your own electricity consumption. So here in the graph on the right, or the flow chart, just wanted to show how this works with renewable generation and traditional generation. So we have a coal plant on top, we have a renewable energy, a wind farm on bottom. They are both selling their electricity onto the grid. But the wind farm also generates a renewable energy certificate, or energy attribute certificate in North America. And in this graph, they're called renewable energy certificates. The wind farm is generating both electricity, which goes to the grid, and an energy attribute certificate, which can follow the electricity onto the grid, or can be sold to a company like yourselves. And along with electricity from the grid, you can make a renewable energy claim with that EAC.
Yeah, so Ellie, I think that's a really important point, because EACs can be very confusing. And a lot of times when people think of EACs, they think of the unbundled version where you just go out and, oh, I'm just buying this EAC, I'm not really procuring renewable energy. But at the end of the day, to make a renewable energy claim, as you mentioned, to say we're using renewable energy, you need to have an EAC to back that up. Otherwise, you cannot. And that's actually in the US, that's per the Federal Trade Commission. That would be a violation of the Federal Trade Commission rules if you were to make a false claim that you're using renewable energy, if in fact you do not have the certificates to back that up. So it's an important concept, but sometimes can be very confusing.
There are different kinds of EACs. So EACs is kind of the catch-all term for a variety of energy attribute certificates. These typically vary by region. So in North America, you might have heard of something called a REC. It's a renewable energy certificate. That's the EAC that operates in North America. In Europe, they're called guarantees of origin, or GOs. In the UK specifically, they're called the REGOs. Australia, we have LGCs, which stand for large scale generation certificates. And then in various countries around the world, we have IRECs, we have Tigers. These are also energy attribute certificates that are in many countries in Southeast Asia and Central and South America and Africa. All of these they're all EACs. They all work the same. They're just called different things in different markets. So if you have operations across these markets, you might buy RECs for your North America operations, GOs for EU, and IRECs for a facility in Malaysia, for example. And they all together constitute your EAC procurement strategy. There are also
really quickly, Elliot, before we move on to that point, just to add on to the EACs, in one of the earlier modules, Elliot had mentioned, there's different sort of in North America, there's one big grid for renewable energy procurement, so the market, the grid market, and then in Europe similarly. So what that really means is that there's an entity that regulates and manages procurement of renewable energy. And so that agency then creates these certificates, and then they say what the name is. So that's why we have IRECs and JRECs and RECs and GOs, REGOs, and all these different ones, right? Because they're the different regulating entities in the different markets for these certificates. Yeah.
Yeah, good clarification, Nicola. Alongside the energy attribute certificates themselves, there are also third-party certification and verification programs that track the transactions of EACs from when they're generated to when they're retired. And these can be super helpful to avoid some of these claims about greenwashing or double counting, because if you are procuring EACs that are third-party certified from organizations such as Green E, IREC, or Eco Energy, you can be sure that someone is auditing the transactions and is auditing that an EAC is not being claimed twice. So these organizations are not global. So Green E, for example, operates primarily in North America and a few small markets in Southeast Asia. Eco Energy operates mostly in the EU. So these aren't available everywhere, but we recommend if you're going to procure EACs, if you're going to procure RECs in North America, for example, you should try to get RECs that are Green E certified, because that's going to give you the most confidence that you're making quality purchase, that the RECs you're purchasing aren't being double counted or double claimed. Some programs that we have talked about before, like CDP and RE100, require a third-party certification when it's available. So if you're in a market that has Green E certification, for example, these programs require you to procure EACs that have been certified by these organizations. So just keep these in mind. The terms like Green E and RECs can be kind of interchangeable, but just want to make everyone comfortable with like EACs are the mechanism itself, and then Green E and Eco Energy and such kind of sit on top and provide a layer of certification on top of that. So just to talk quickly about some benefits and some things you should consider when thinking about EACs as a procurement method. So some benefits, they're really easy to source in most markets. Most markets have EACs available, definitely North America and EU, and many parts of Southeast Asia and Central America and South America have EACs readily available. The prices will differ region to region, but most markets will have these that you can purchase. For this reason, it's really easy, or I should say it's simple, not easy, to scale up a procurement method, procurement strategy using EACs. So you can kind of quickly figure out how to do this, quickly scale it up to your global portfolio, and quickly meet your goals using EACs. They can also form a nice way to fill some gaps. So let's say you want to focus on on-site solar and large-scale power purchase agreements for the core of your renewable energy procurement strategy, but you have operations in other parts of the world where those methods aren't feasible. You can kind of fill in the gaps with EACs. So they're a great way to fill out your portfolio if your portfolio is anchored in a few key strategies in a few key markets. Some things you should consider, though, with unbundled EACs, they're not considered the most impactful way of procuring renewable energy. They don't have no impact, obviously, because you are providing a monetary incentive to projects that are creating renewable energy, so they do have impact. But it's not considered as impactful as going out and installing solar yourselves on your own facilities, or contracting with a large wind farm to source renewable energy from the wind farm. So some organizations are viewing unbundled EACs as a less preferable method. So you should consider them in that context, and consider, do your own risk profile to kind of figure out what types of risks you're comfortable taking on with a EAC procurement strategy.
And I think, to add on to that, Elliot, one of the things that makes the unbundled certificate sort of less impactful is that while you're making a monetary payment, right, which is of value to the energy provider, the renewable energy provider, it's actually generally a one-off. So you maybe do it on an annual basis, whereas typically the VPPAs, the power purchase agreements, or solar on your roof, right, a lease, or whether you buy it, is a long-term or significant expenditure. And so that there's obviously more revenue going into the pockets of that provider than an annual, maybe, an annual purchase of RECs that may not be a long-term commitment. So that's really one of the things. But there are ways to make a contract for long-term certificate purchase from a renewable energy project provider, which would provide a valuable revenue stream. So it's not to say that unbundled are always lower impact. It really just depends. But again, the more impact generally means it's a relatively more expensive, or at least a more durable commitment. It's not always more expensive, but so it gets a little complicated. But don't think that unbundled RECs are always less impactful, because they can be impactful.
Agreed. Yeah. Another consideration with EACs are some cost volatility. So since, as Nicola mentioned, you're typically procuring EACs on an annual basis, the prices can fluctuate year to year. So you might get a certain price for EACs one year, next year it'll be different, it'll be higher, it'll be lower. So it's a bit trickier to project your costs over a long period of time. Whereas if you have a virtual power purchase agreement, these are typically 10, 15, 20 years. So you know the price that you're paying for renewable energy over that contract. If you have on-site solar, you know you're going to have the panels for 15, 20 years. So there is some volatility inherent in the unbundled EAC market. And lastly, there's no possible way to have a like measurable return on investment when we're procuring unbundled EACs, as opposed to something like on-site solar can, after a certain amount of time, it can actually have a positive return because you're just generating free energy from the sun shining. Once you sort of pay back some of the installation and the equipment costs, you can actually get a positive return on investment. Other options like power purchase, like virtual power purchase agreements, depending on the ways these things are contracted, it can be a positive revenue source. So instead of being an annual expenditure, some of these contracts have actually been quite lucrative for companies that have engaged in them. But with EACs, you're not really getting that because it's just kind of an annual expenditure that you're outlaying, and you're not going to get a monetary return on them.
And just as a reminder, Elliot will be going into more detail about the power purchase agreements and succession modules.
Exactly. Yep. Some best practices when you're considering sourcing unbundled EACs. Again, avoid double claiming. This can be avoided by using third-party certification groups like Greenie and Eco Energy and others. Think about the vintage. So vintage is when the EAC was generated. So if the megawatt hours were generated in March of 2022, that's the vintage of the EAC. And you want to match the vintage to when you are making the claim within a reasonable period of time. Typically this is considered to be a year. So if you you can apply a January 2022 EAC to consumption in December of 2022. That's okay. Anything longer than that, you start to get into a bit of murky water. But we typically want to have the vintage of the EAC match when we're making the claim of the renewable energy. Location is important. We talked about this, about the market boundaries. So if you have electricity consumption in North America, you want to be procuring an EAC from North America. You can't procure an EAC from China and apply it to electricity consumption in Texas because it's not one electricity market. In most parts of the world, these markets follow the physical or the country geography. So for consumption in China, you need to source China EACs. For consumption in Japan, Japanese EACs, and etc. The two caveats to that are North America, so Canada and the US are considered one electricity market, and in the EU, EU member countries, AIB countries are considered one electricity markets. You can source renewable energy in France and apply it to electricity in Germany, for example. And then lastly, eligible sources. We talked about this a bit in the previous module. You want to make sure that the EACs you're using are coming from eligible renewable energy sources that align with your procurement strategy and the decisions you've made previously with regard to which renewable energy sources you're using. So if you've said, we're not going to use biomass, make sure you're not procuring EACs that were generated from biomass. A typical roadmap for procuring EACs can look as such. So, you want to start with measuring your consumption, engaging internal stakeholders on, the goals that you've set, getting them comfortable with the costs. Then you want to solicit bids. You go out to the market. You say, we are looking for 10,000 EACs in North America and 5,000 in France and 2,000 in Malaysia. And you can get back bids from brokers with specific pricing for those instruments. And then in the last step, you want to evaluate those bids, ensure that they're meeting the goals that you've defined with your renewable energy procurement strategy, and then execute on those. And again, this is a process. In the first year, you'll go through each of these steps. In subsequent years, you'll likely just skip to the solicit and execute steps where you've done all the previous work. Now you just need to know, okay, how much do we need? Go out to market, get bids back, evaluate those bids, and execute on those. Yeah, so that concludes our deep dive into energy attribute certificates. Again, this is a term we're going to keep hearing in subsequent modules and in the entirety of your renewable energy journey. So a good module to return to if you have any follow-up questions about EACs. In the next module, we're going to be getting into utility programs, so how to source renewable energy through your existing utility relationships, and a bit about on-site renewables.